last week we covered the virtue, again, on a survey level. Always remembering this is a survey, not a complete analysis, because you can't completely analyze any of the particular virtues because they are, again, an encounter with God. Because in order to grow in these virtues, especially the cardinal virtues, which is what we've been talking about, again, that this is the human response to God, but still that we need God's help in these things. And so God gives us the knowledge to understand them. And primarily the way in which we grow in all of the cardinal virtues, whether it be justice, fortitude, prudence, or temperance, is that the way in which we grow in them is by one, understanding, and that's why investigation and study is so pivotal and key, but also, again, putting them into action. And we'll be talking about putting them into action much more next week when we come to the virtue of fortitude. But this week we've come to the virtue of temperance. And so just kind of to recap some of what we talked about last week, again, is that prudence, again, especially when you're concerning yourself with questions of, is this a question of justice or prudence? Remembering that justice always deals with things which are moral. So if there's not a moral component to whatever the question or, again, the action that you're dealing with, because, again, remembering that virtues are always, again, in association with action. Virtuous behavior always implies action. So we're not talking about concepts. We're talking about, again, the ways and modes of being, the ways and modes in which we move, the ways in which we act. So do we act in justice, or do we not act in justice? But again, that justice always has, again, a moral component to it. That's how you know it's a just. It's because it's black and white, versus prudence, which deals with, again, the multiplicity of goods, all the different good choices that we make. So prudence oftentimes, again, is one, always has usually a time element to it. Again, it has a temporal reality. It also, again, prudence deals with questions of, for instance, location. It also deals with questions of the environment, environmental settings, the places where you find yourself. Another question of prudence is, again, temporal reality, the changing world, how things change in terms of sciences, evolution, things like this, as well as viability. And so what do I mean by this? I'll give you an example. The virtue, or it's virtuous to be modest. But modesty is, again, always a question of both temperance and prudence. It's not merely a question of justice. Although if you violate it, again, it can touch upon justice if you're leading a person into lust. But modesty, for the most part, again, sometimes it's what you wear is completely dependent upon your time and location, your setting, again, who you're with. Because in some cases, between a husband and wife, it's not imprudent or, again, unjust to wear nothing at all. Obviously, that's kind of what marriage is about, is, again, to have that intimacy, again, the conjugal union. But again, to walk into church with no clothes on would be what? Well, yeah.
Or a distraction.
A distraction, one, yes. But you're dealing with what? It's a question. It's very imprudent. You're leading people into injustice by lust. But at the end of the day, you're what? The setting. Again, this is the relative setting. That's why I say that prudence deals with relative things that are going on. Time, location, place like this. Again, because you're not dealing with black and white. Because, again, your clothing and what you wear is not a question of black and white. It's, again, what is appropriate to the setting. And so that's where people who get so... But you can go to the extreme of saying, well, you cannot wear shorts in church. Well, yes, you can wear shorts in church. And again, actually for people who are poor, that might be the only thing that they wear. And I'd rather have them in church wearing shorts. And they're not violating justice, because that's where we can sometimes get into, again, manners. And again, things like this, which are, again, oftentimes dependent upon culture, upon, again, location, again, where you are, again, the setting. Cultural norms can play an element of this. That's where sometimes people, again, even things like this at church, like, for instance, what is prudent music to play at Mass? What is imprudent music to play at Mass? Well, that's where you'll get people who put this into, if you look at it in black and white, and you say, well, this is wrong music to play at Mass. Well, no, unless it's leading people into sin, unless it has offensive lyrics, you're not, again, violating justice. But again, if you're playing Kumbaya at Mass, well, no, this is not the most prudent thing to play, because this doesn't really have a religious connotation. Does this make sense? That's why, but if you fall too much into well, this is black and white, you can't do this thing, well, then you start, again, cutting out a lot of those alternative goods, those good choices that many people make. Because, for instance, you might not prefer to have drums at Mass. You might not find that to be a religious or a sacrament or a holy experience. You might not find that to be personally reverent yourself. But for a young person, having drums at Mass, again, there's no moral connotation to this. It's just a question of in the time and the setting. And so that's why we can't fall too far into a rigid mindset where everything is black and white. We have to recognize that, no, there is a bigger picture at place, and that sometimes, again, obviously we're not going to have drums 8 o'clock in the morning. Again, but the 6 o'clock Mass, we're going to have drums. We're going to have, again, more lively music, because music is, again, dependent upon the setting. There's not something which is black and white here. So again, also when you're looking at prudence, you're oftentimes dealing with, again, all these different things. What's the location that I find myself? What's the proper thing to do in this location? What's the proper thing to do in this particular moment of time? Because sometimes it's imprudent to say something which it might be true, but you say something in the improper time and you might do more damage. You might be perfectly just, but if you're imprudent, you might do a tremendous amount of damage to a person if it's not the right time. Likewise, your environment, your environmental setting, temporal reality, again, things are changing. That's why the church looks at various things and says, okay, what parts of technology can we use? What things can we use within medicine? What is prudent for us to use and what is very imprudent? And also the church will also say, and this is not sometimes even when looking at medical ethics, this is not a question of prudence, this is a question of justice because it violates one of our moral norms. We talked about a little bit about that last week. Also, again, what's the chance of success? Is it prudent to go to war right now? I'm not saying right now, but I'm just saying that political leaders or military generals sometimes have to look and say, is it prudent? Is there a viability that we are going to succeed? Because or is it going to be colossal collateral damage? Because if they look at that and they say, okay, well, maybe it's just, maybe again we have a just cause for going into war, but right now it'd be very imprudent to do so because we have no chance of success. Therefore, we have to wait. So that's again why also I said last week that prudence, oftentimes acting in the correct moment, it's very difficult sometimes because we have to practice patience. Because sometimes prudence dictates that we wait. And we sometimes have to permit an evil to occur if acting right now would be to cause a greater evil to occur. But that's different than when we act, again, and start doing things which are evil, acting in an evil manner to bring about a good end. The difference between utilitarianism, which again, that my good motives, my good intentions justify whatever I do. Again, that doesn't work. That's condemned. But at the same time, again, that we do at times have to permit evil to occur because we act like God. God permits evil to occur. He never acts upon it or brings about evil by causing it. Does this make sense? So, now, when evaluating, okay, well, how do I grow in prudence? Okay, as you take into account all these different things. Well, first of all, you have to be just. So know, does this violate a moral norm? As long as you're not violating a moral norm, then for the most part, you know you're being just. Then the question becomes, is this prudent? Because you're dealing with all these different multiplicity of goods. You're dealing with, again, lots of good choices. Once you've eliminated the justice question, then it becomes a question of prudence. But then the real question when you're dealing with prudence, let me switch my computer. It's not picking up. Clear. Is that you are free to choose, again, the good things. Again, prudence enables you to choose the proper good in the proper moment from the multiplicity of goods that God presents you. God will never present you with only evil options. He will always, again, the scripture says he will always provide you with a way out if you're confronted with evil. And so when you're confronted with evil, again, sometimes the way out is, again, to permit it to occur, but not to cause it. Prudence never allows herself to choose and eat a bad fruit or make a bad, evil decision. Again, it is never prudent to eat bad or unjust fruit. Again, because prudence never allows herself to participate in or be complicit within an evil act. Again, she works with justice to crush evil fruits underfoot, but again, allows at times evil to occur if to act would be to cause a greater harm. Because again, like this we read last week from the parable of the wheat and the tares. God allows the wheat and the tares, the bad seed and the good seed to grow up together, because to pull out the bad seed too early might mean he loses some of his good seed, and he will not act. He has to sometimes. But again, when we're actually making choices which just deal with the good, which only deal with a multiplicity of goods, again, sometimes when we're choosing that, we also know that too much of any good thing can cause problems, just as drinking can lead to drunkenness. Again, so just because it's a good thing doesn't mean that it's always, again, the right thing to do. And that's where, when evaluating, am I being prudent, you also have to say, again, kind of the checks and balances for prudence is temperance. is, am I being balanced? Because that's what actually temperance deals with, is the virtue of balance, of being balanced in one's life. Because when you look on a spiritual level, there's two things where we oftentimes find ourselves swinging between, and that's pride and envy. Pride and envy are the two things, because a person will oftentimes, again, just like the pit and the pendulum from Edgar Allan Poe, which goes back and forth, it goes from one extreme to the other, and cuts what? The danger is that it'll cut them in half. Again, as we see within that, pride and envy will eventually lead to us being killed. Again, experiencing a type of death, because what pride and envy does is that the virtue, which is also associated with temperance, will be humility. Because if you want to be a temperate person and a prudent person, you must be a humble one. But pride and envy swing us back and forth between, again, sometimes people think the opposite of pride is humility. It's not true. The opposite of pride being an extreme position, the opposite of pride will be envy, because pride is where you think you need nothing. You're totally self-sufficient. You are God. That you need nothing. Okay? And the opposite of that is where you think that you need what other people have. Where you have no gifts yourself. You need to feed upon what the gifts of other people are. If that makes sense. So you swing back and forth between pride, where you need nothing, versus envy, where you need everything that other people have, because you have nothing. Does this make sense? Which is why the opposite of pride is not going to be humility. The opposite of pride will be envy, which is where you'll find the balance between the two of them. You'll find humility. Not between having, what we'll look at in just a few minutes, a bloated self-esteem, but also not having an anorexic, starving self-esteem. It's actually having a well-formed confidence. Yes?
Well, don't you need a certain amount of personal pride
Well, that's what we're
to
going to...
be a healthy person?
Correct. To have humility means that you will have a certain level of healthy pride or healthy confidence. But you won't be going to go to the extreme of arrogance.
Okay.
So, but we're going to open that up in just a second. Humility, and this is why I use the example of humility, is seeing ourselves as diamonds. The diamonds of our Lord. That again, that we are small, but we're exceedingly precious. That again, that in comparison to God is that we are almost nothing, but yet God raises us up and we are His children. But that just because God raises us up does not mean that we are equal to God. And this is the danger of pride. But again, when you fall into the opposite extreme, which is again self-abuse, or when you start flogging yourself on the back, thinking that you are garbage, you are nothing, which is, I would say, the danger of, again, what Martin Luther, again, that idea that we are just crap, and that, which is literally what he says. He says that we are a dunghill. Human nature is dung, and God covers it with grace. But underneath it, you still have that dung. You still have that human nature, which is crap. Which I'd say is the exact opposite of where God wants us to be. God doesn't want us to believe that we are garbage. That He comes, He redeems, He restores, and He elevates us. We are His children. But we're also still being His children, not equal to the Father. And so again, that we see ourselves as diamonds. Now, a diamond is also multifaceted. Just like a human being is multifaceted. If you just polish one facet of the diamond, again, it's not going to be beautiful. You have to polish every facet of the diamond. And that's, again, it's the prism of the diamond. It's, again, all those facets which are all polished, which will make, again, for a beautiful jewel, versus, again, if you cover those facets up or you just polish one, you're going to, again, it's going to look ugly. But underneath it, it's still that diamond. And human nature, I'd say, is very similar in regards to this. Because God wants us to be polished. He wants us to, again, be multifaceted, multidimensional beings, where we are, again, balanced in all of the regards of our life. Not just one way where we are excellent, but we are excellent human beings, which means that we are excellent in all of the facets of who we are called to be. Does this make sense? Okay. So, temperance is exactly this. Temperance in artwork is always depicted with a jar of wine and a jar of water, because it's prudent to do both. Sometimes, as St. Paul says, a little bit of wine, Timothy, drink a little bit of wine. It's good for your stomach. He said, but don't become a drunk. He says what? Prudence always holds both, because sometimes it's prudent to drink wine, sometimes it's prudent to drink water. But if you only drink one or the other, you'll become either a prude or a drunk. And so likewise, temperance is, again, finding the balance between both. Obviously, though, if you have an addiction to alcohol, it would be imprudent to drink alcohol. But for the most part, that's where also, again, not falling into that rigid, because you will find, and I haven't experienced this because I've done stuff with AA and stuff, AA and worked with alcoholism and things like that, you can sometimes people become so rooted in what their particular, what God is calling them to be, that they think that everyone else it must apply to everyone else as well. Because they can't drink alcohol, they call it the devil drink. And that everyone will be led into sin by it. That's not necessarily true. That's where, again, even we look at scriptures and we see that, but again, alcohol is an easy way to understand temperance, but temperance is much more than just dealing with alcohol. Temperance is, again, being balanced in life and having, again, being able to choose the good but not be ruled by the good, by the particular good. But we are ruled by the universal good. Again, the balance of all things, both in work and life, and this is where you find basic human needs, that we have mental needs, physical needs, spiritual needs, and that we have to be balanced in all of these faculties. That again, this also goes in correlation with why, again, in psychology, we use psychology in the church, and we're not opposed to psychology. And again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of you might be familiar with from when you did studies. Again, where we talk about the basic human needs versus the higher level of needs. Again, but if you don't take those basic ones into account, then again, sometimes it's okay to eat a cupcake. Don't eat cupcakes all day long. It'll lead you into gluttony. And likewise, again, it's good to eat apples. But again, sometimes you need to, enjoy. It's not just about, having a life with no joy where you can't take advantage of some of the joys in life, some of the good things. But again, don't go to, extreme behavior. Extreme behavior is never good. Because that's where you, again, become a one-dimensional person. And you won't find joy in being one-dimensional. And actually, I would say this, one of the fruits of having a balanced and temperate life is actually freedom. That we find joy being the fruit, oftentimes, of prudence. We'll find peace being the fruit of justice. We'll find freedom in actually balance. That's where you will find actually more freedom. Because if you don't feel free, or you're experiencing a lack of freedom where you find compelled, it's usually because extreme behavior enslaves you to an extreme. Just like addiction will enslave you to the drink. Or again, TV can enslave you, or you become enslaved to a particular thing. And so the way of actually correcting an enslavement, correcting something which is an addiction, is not to go to the opposite extreme, but it's to find the balance in between. Does this make sense? Now that's, again, easier said than done, but this is also why this is associated with the virtue of right judgment, which is a gift of the Holy Spirit, one of the 7 gifts which are given to you in confirmation. Again, right judgment, which comes from obviously understanding being the fruit, understanding and wisdom being the fruit of prudence, which is why they go hand in hand. This will also, again, associated with right judgment is also piety. Again, another fruit of the Spirit, because piety is not walking around and pretending to be pious. All that piety is the authentic expressions of love. Again, which are individual to the individual person. Everyone has their own pious things that we do. And this doesn't make us hypocrites. Each of us have different things. Some of us might pray the rosary. Some of us might have Marian devotion. Some of you might have devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. All these different pious, which are just authentic little expressions of love. Little kisses that we give to God. Again, that's where you oftentimes, though, fall into a person who will say, you have to do this particular pious action in order to be a good Catholic. And that's not true. That's your particular pious devotion. That's where sometimes people will say, to be a good Catholic, you have to play a rosary. It's not true. The rosary is a pious devotion. It's an authentic expression, a kiss that some people give to God. Some people don't find it helpful. And then they feel guilty that they're not doing this. This is not a balanced approach to spirituality, because a balanced approach to spirituality is recognizing there's lots of different ways in which we can pray. You can pray with the rosary. You can also play Lectio Divina. You can meditate. You can contemplate. You can take time for apophatic prayer. You can take time for praise and worship. And that's where, again, if we get too much into this rigid mindset, is that what rigidity does, is that rigidity usually throws us to one extreme, far right, or one extreme, far left. And this is not always, sometimes it's, you can see it blatantly, but sometimes even in the spiritual life, this can be subtle. And that's where, when we start judging people, and there's usually no moral component to it, we know that we are becoming scrupulous. Or scrupulosity is, an extreme type of behavior, which is, contrary to the virtue of temperance. Because not only are we called to be temperate in our own lives, but we're called to look into the lives of other people, and likewise recognize that, this person's path might be different than mine. And again, when we start judging people based upon the particular goods that they choose, that's when we become judgmental people, unless there's a moral component to it. Because if there's a moral component to it, then we know that we're dealing with justice, and we can make a determination on justice, because justice is black and white. Does this make sense? Yes?
Well, I guess that extremists in the manner of Jesus Christ is okay. For example, one of the biggest extremists I know of is St. Francis of Assisi, tearing off your clothes and
Correct.
and just, he was an extremist. He was not a temperate man.
Well, but Francis
It's okay with the church to be that extreme.
But Francis also recognized that not everyone was called to that type of behavior. He himself felt called and impelled to it. That was his pious thing, but he didn't demand that all the Franciscans did what he did. He recognized that he was called to this particular form of expression of love, absolute poverty, but not everyone was. And he was actually pretty clear in that. And actually, even for some of his extreme behaviors, he actually, at the end of his life, actually recognized and told his brothers that he was actually wrong. That he actually, when he talked about the flagelations and the things that the self-abuse that he did on his body, and he called his body brother ass, he actually told his brothers at the end of the day, he said, I should have treated brother ass a little bit better because this was a gift from God. He said, I was a little too extreme in my devotion. I was a little bit too zealous. I should have actually been more. And that's what he actually said. He said that in some of his behaviors, that again, we see the zeal was good, but sometimes in his zeal he did things which was actually a little extreme that he himself recognized. But at the end of the day, he's also a saint, because even though in his zealous behavior sometimes he went overboard, and that's why to be a saint doesn't mean that you're perfect. That's why even Francis isn't perfect in everything he did. But he also, again, even in his life, even while he was doing that, we also see that he never again was scrupulous in the sense that he demanded all of his brothers to do it as well. He recognized that this was how he was expressing his love for the Lord. Does that make so? Also, this is why I say that the fruit of it is also freedom. The freedom of expression of self. The freedom to express yourself in the way that the Lord is calling you to. An abomination, if you actually understand what an abomination, the word abomination actually means, abomination is when something becomes bloated. It's when something becomes out of its norm, out of what God has intended for it. It's actually, if you've ever seen like RoboCop, when the guy falls into the vat of liquid, and he comes out and he's like all misshapen, and that's why he's out of right proportion. That's what actually that's actually what the classic understanding of the word abomination means, which is why in Scripture it says it identifies various things as abominations, because it's out of order. It's not beautiful anymore. It becomes extremely bloated, or extremely anorexic, or extremely whatever. It becomes misshapen. And it's no longer beautiful, no longer promotes anything which is good, and doesn't bring life. And so that's why, again, when you look at the word abomination, again, self-indulgence, again, extreme self-indulgence will lead to, again, extreme behaviors, will lead to a loss of temperance. It's also like greed. Again, actually the sins of the flesh, as C.S. Lewis calls them, the sins of the passions, which move us into extreme behaviors. Greed, gluttony, and lust are all dangerous. They're not quite as dangerous as pride and envy. But greed, gluttony, and lust are what? When we overindulge in what? The sexual appetites. Or you overindulge in what? The physical appetites. Or you overindulge in this need to control, this need to have, this need of greed, which will oftentimes be prompted and motivated by envy. These things, again, all of these things will enslave. All of these things will actually limit your free will. They will actually make you enslaved to them, because you will be impelled to do them. Again, almost by compulsion, if you look at them. What people are oftentimes compulsory, they don't want to be greedy people, but by compulsion they're greedy. They can't help it. By compulsion, a person is oftentimes lustful. They can't help it. Or by compulsion, you'll find a person who just compulsively eats, or compulsively doesn't eat. Again, these types of things actually, and you can see that when you have compulsion, again, or obsession, that these things are indicators of a lack of temperance. And so sometimes people will try to apply justice to these things, and they won't get the right result. Because I'd say that in the United States, for the most part, and this is just my own personal opinion, but for the most part in the United States, we actually are fairly just people. We're becoming more unjust as the years progress. But if you actually go back to the root cause of a lot of the problems in our country, And probably one of the spiritual problems that exist in our culture is that for the most part, we are a pretty accepting people. Again, we're pretty open. Again, we're open to lots of different things, lots of new experiences. We're pretty adventurous. Again, so actually I'd say that for the most part, we're fairly prudent. And we actually, through history, have been a fairly prudent people. Not always, but again, pretty good in prudence. And we always, again, as a country, we oftentimes, again, our country was built upon, again, right and wrong, that people knew what was right and wrong. That's being challenged now. But what we've not been since the very beginning is a very temperate people. Again, we've oftentimes been overindulgent. Again, in the pursuit of freedom, individual freedoms, we oftentimes have what? Overindulged. And I'd say that actually the law, now see, if you are intemperate, it will lead to the other virtues going astray as well. But I'd say that that's also why people don't think that intemperate behavior is really that bad. Intemperate behavior, these things right here, will lead to serious, serious problems. Eventually, we will start challenging not just prudence, but you'll start challenging justice itself. And I'd say that actually that's why we have to be cautious and aware in our own spiritual lives, again, of the tendency to overindulge in things and the tendency to fall to extreme behaviors, because it will upset us, and not, as we can see, not only on the collective level, but on the personal level. What time is it? I just want to keep aware. Okay. Which is why self-mastery of the passions is so important. This is where discipline comes in. Also personal discipline, which actually I'd say as American people, which everyone knows, as Americans, that we have, that most of us are a little bit overweight. That much more so statistically speaking than the rest of the world. It's also we are wealthier. Again, we have the creature comfort. We have, a lot of people are addicted to TV or to their phones or to different things. Again, because we have comfort, creature comforts. Again, being a wealthy nation, we have a lot of those creature comforts, but creature comforts automatically will undermine temperance if we don't have discipline and self-mastery. And we're very clear in what we are going to do and what we don't have. And this is why, discipline is, a spiritual component. That self-discipline and being a disciplined person is, not just something, and I can say this because I'm not the best in this. But I can say that without discipline, I can tell you that it's much easier for me to sin. Without that personal self-discipline, knowing what my schedule is, knowing what I'm going to do. If I just have the freedom to do whatever I want, like I did when I was a teenager, as we all know, teenagers who you give them a tremendous amount of freedom, which is part of what growing up entails, is being given more freedoms, but they just become lazy and they do whatever they want. And they don't have success, they oftentimes become stagnant. Which is why freedom is a good thing, but freedom for the sake of freedom is actually can lead to oftentimes overindulgence in the passions. So, going back to this idea of high self-esteem, low self-esteem, low self-esteem, which I'd say that this is also there's a spiritual component to this. You can have, people who are always looking at the gifts of others, who are envious, who think that they need what other people have, and without that, they're never going to be happy. Where you'll find jealousy and greed. But you also have, the high self-esteem where you're bloated and think that, that the world exists for you, that everyone else exists for your pleasure. And so both of these, I'd say, envy and pride are automatically the enemies always of humility. Because between the low self-esteem and the high self-esteem, or the starving anorexic one and the bloated fat one, you'll find actually humility. Both of them are going to be, I should say, rooted in arrogance. Because if you say that you are worth nothing, that's pretty arrogant, if you actually understand it correctly. Most people don't think it's arrogant, but to say that you are worth nothing, God created you. That's pretty arrogant to say that God was wrong when He created you, when God who knows all things. That's why people who have an extremely low self-esteem, they think they know more about themselves than they actually do. They're not open to the mystery, the beauty of who they are. Which is why helping them encountering the beauty and mystery of who they are is very healing. But if they're not willing to accept that they are beautiful or a good person, they have no potential for that. That's a very arrogant position. Just as arrogant as the high self-esteem. Because the high self-esteem is self-infatuated. You're getting the bloated ego. It's easier to see. It's obviously rooted in pride, where you'll find, the sense of gluttony very often. And but this will also deal with the illusion of control. People who are prideful think that they're in control, think that they know all the answers, think that they control the world, think that they, you can see this most certainly in, I'd say, popular politicians. The low self-esteem, though, is equally rooted in arrogance because there's a self-loathing, as opposed to, again, a self-infatuation, the self-loathing, again, which is the starving ego, which is, again, rooted in envy. Again, it will lead to an envy and likewise greed, and the grasping for control, the wanting control, which, again, usually what motivates greed is, again, wanting more and more control because, again, of fear. Both of them are actually rooted in fear because one of them is afraid of what they don't know, and the other one is afraid of what they do know. But both of them are rooted in fear. Yes?
Doesn't it all go back, I mean, this is just the way I feel, doesn't it all go back pretty much to family?
Yes, a lot of it does go back to family. A lot of these types of things are learned in the family. This is why the most effective teachers of teaching the gospel is the faith. And most effective teachers in teaching pain and suffering is also the same people.
Outside of God, I can't think of anything or anybody that I know that I love and care about more than the family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's,
Correct. For the family can become a great source of joy, but it can also become a great source of pain when things go wrong.
well, yeah, it can.
But I'm just going to keep going. So between these two extremes, you're going to find, again, confidence, self-confidence. And you'll also find humility. Because the truly humble person is not infatuated with themselves, but they also don't hate themselves. They appreciate themselves. They're grateful for their life. Gratitude. You'll also find that between the bloated and the starving ego is, again, the well-proportioned, the healthy ego. That, again, we recognize we're capable of much, but we're not capable of everything. You'll also find, again, between them, again, obviously, you won't find the truly humble person both be envious because they're grateful. And they aren't prideful because they never recognize the need for prayers of, again, petition to God. They petition God for what they need. They recognize they don't need everything. They need things. And again, actually, the truly humble person, the most humble person, is, I would say, the person who recognizes that actually, for the most part, they have no control. There's no control. They have no control. God is in control. And they're actually comfortable with that because they know that God drives the car much better than they do. And so, again, when they leave control, especially that control, which is actually, I would say, for the most part, an illusion. Because even when we think we're in control, the only thing I'd say that you're in absolute control over is your free will. That's it. You're not even in control of your body, for the most part, because your body does involuntarily things that you can't always help. Again, my sisters aren't always pleased with my involuntary digestive problems. And I don't have a lot of control over it. Again, my mom gave me a bad gallbladder, and two of my sisters lost their gallbladder. But even our bodies, we don't have absolute control over even our own bodies. But you do have control over your free will. Which is why what God asks from you is actually, He doesn't oftentimes even ask you for your thoughts, doesn't ask you for your feelings, because you can't always control those things, but He asks you for your will. What will you do, or what will you not do? Will you follow me, or will you choose to walk away? Which is the gospel reading today. So again, looking again at the multiple facets of the person, again, going back to this, the bodily, the spiritual, the animal, the angelic, again, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, that we have needs in all of these. Again, we have a right side of the brain and a left side of the brain. We have to be cognizant of the needs of both, the creativity, but also the analytic. Again, within this, again, appreciating the multi, and this is why, again, the philosophy of the human person and our understanding of the human person in the church is also something which is at a certain point dogmatic, because we believe that we're creating the image and likeness of God. And so likewise, that we have many different needs that have to be accounted for, because the real question becomes, how balanced are we? Because if we want to be prudent people, we must be balanced. And again, cognizant, aware of all of the needs that we have, because when we become fixated upon one thing, we find ourselves unhealthy, which is actually violations of temperance will bring oftentimes unhealthiness, which will manifest itself in disease sometimes. Yes?
Your last term, you had when you had the arrogance on your side, doesn't that kind of represent our constant struggles to balance ourselves?
Yes. Yes.
Spiritual warfare.
Yes, this is spiritual warfare, yes. What Satan comes in, he does is he unbalances God's plan. And human beings allow that they choose to allow it to happen. Although they sin in ignorance, they also sin in partial knowledge. But yes, this is a huge focus of all spiritual warfare. It's finding that balance in between, because that's why Jesus calls us to humility. So the call to be temperate is actually a fundamental key part of the gospel. Absolutely. Because this is where you'll find God's plan. God's plan is for things to be well ordered and beautiful, not to be extreme, where they are extremely gross on one side or the other, where they become abominable. Does that make sense? Let me flip through these real quick. So that's why, again, people who ignore them, again, this is why it was also understood that disease, where disease comes from, is intemperate behavior. Intemperate, that's why, again, we see that there is a connection between disease, again, and the causes of that being rooted in denial of God's plan, trying to warp and twist it. Again, that when you overeat, you get diabetes. Now, is a person necessarily sinning when they do that? Well, not if they're not cognizant of it, or their culpability might be severely negated. But the bad behavior is moving against God's plan. What God's plan for our well-being and for our health can bring about real diseases. You have a huge amount of stress, which is not a healthy thing, and you do nothing to correct it. It can cause a heart attack. That we see that, again, a lot of the causes of disease in the world are rooted, but the person has a lot of amount of stress. The reason why they have stress is because they've made choices, or they're refusing to make choices, like the refusal to work less and to take some time on Sunday for their family, which would actually recharge and regenerate them and renew them so they could work better throughout the week. But we find that when we go into extreme behaviors is that you will see that disease is a cause of this, which is why, again, also associated with disease is the abomination type thing. But when I'm saying abomination, I don't mean it in the very negative way that people oftentimes throw it around. I'm talking about it in terms of God's plan, God's order. And these are indicators of things which are moving against God's plan, God's order. Now, the person's not responsible for the sin, but it doesn't mean that when we move against God's plan, there's no effect, cause and effect. Even if a person's not aware of the destructive value of a bad decision, it still is going to have a bad effect. So, again, being balanced, again, there's also a question is how temperate are we? Which is why temperance, again, just a few things to just hopefully helpful little hints for today. Temperance is, again, being aware of our needs of our body, which is, again, if you took my class in spiritual desolation and discernment of spirits, we talk about, again, the causes of desolation can sometimes be physical. Physical things have to be solved in a physical way. Don't pray away an eating disorder. Again, go and get the help that you need. Don't pray away, again, diabetes. Take your medicine. Again, physical problems require physical response. Likewise, another need being temperate is, again, relational on the level of soul, the animal. Again, the relational, the pack mentality, that we have needs for community, we have needs for relationship. Don't try to, again, eat ice cream to make your problems in your marriage go away. What? Ice cream is what? What we eat when we want something, but when you, go to the wrong, answering the wrong thing the wrong way, again, lots of people do it. Again, don't go and play golf when you're having problems in your marriage. Go to a counselor. Well, you might say, well, I need freedom from the relaxation. Yeah, but if you never solve the problem, then it's going to be a problem. Don't sleep your problems away. Sleep is what you do when you're overworking. It's not when you're having relationship problems. But people oftentimes apply the wrong solution to the wrong problem. There is a right problem, and there's a right solution, but we oftentimes misapply. Likewise, we have needs of spirit, needs of greater things, and you have to be able to balance. That's why you have to be cognizant and aware of what these things are and how these things affect. Because when you know what they are, you can likewise apply the correct solution when there's conflict and when things threaten to throw you out of balance. And so being cognizant, again, that spiritual things require spiritual responses. Relational things require relational responses. Physical things require physical responses. But they do intersect. So you can't just separate these things entirely, because the human person, you can't just separate any of these things because they will intersect. If you have a problem on your physical life, you're more likely to have relationship problems. Because what? You're going to be, again, if you're addicted to coffee, like me, okay? Well, if I had a wife, I probably wouldn't be a very pleasant person in the morning. Okay, but that's why you have to be aware of what these things are, because if you, again, have a physical dependency, or people who are alcoholics, again, which is a physical chemical dependency, well, they're more likely to experience emotional problems in their relationships because it's going to intersect. And they're more likely to actually experience spiritual problems, because then they're going to be brought into questions that God never intended for them to deal with. And therefore, they're more given to that. So again, recognizing that you can't just separate these three things out, that there is an interconnectedness. Yes?
How, given the topic temperance, how do you deal with anger?
I would say that you look and see what the root cause of the anger is. Because if the root cause of the anger is a lack of understanding, you go to the person with the correct understanding. And so in many cases, it can be a spiritual problem. So you'd go to a priest and you'd find the understanding that's associated with the lack of faith or the lack of knowledge. Yeah, so you're talking to me, correct. But sometimes it's a relationship. Sometimes it can be rooted in family, like family history, family past. In that type of case, you wouldn't necessarily want to go to a priest unless the priest was trained as counselor. You'd want to go to a therapist. That's where, again, therapy and counseling and things like that. If you're having a problem in a relationship, it depends on what the nature of the problem is. And when you go back and find the source root, that's why you have to dig and find out, and for many of us, sometimes we have problems that we don't know what the root is. And that's why we have to go to prayer. And you go to prayer and God will reveal to you what that root is. I can guarantee you, you ask it and you sit with it long enough in silence and God will reveal what the root problem is. But then you have to go and find the correct response, because sometimes the root problem for some people is just physical intemperance, that they like the drink. Sometimes that's the problem. They just like the feeling associated with it. They're not necessarily. Most of the time when I've encountered alcoholics, it's usually they're trying to suppress and deal with pain from childhood or things like this, but not always. Sometimes it's just people who like to get drunk. people like it, and likewise, it's usually immature people. But that's why, again, in that case, what you have to do, you go to a detox. You go into a detox, and sometimes the detox can fix it. But that's usually only maybe 1 or 2% of the case. Usually 98% of the time, it's usually a fleeing mechanism, fleeing from problems or a suppression, trying to suppress pain. So again, temperance is also, in the seminary, we were talking about the 4 pillars of our life. That we had 4 pillars that we had to be aware of as priests. Now I'll offer you guys the same thing, because I'm just as human as you are, and we're all called to the same common mission, which is to pursue holiness, to pursue God, and to likewise bring people to heaven. So all of us are fundamentally in the same mission. Just because I'm a priest doesn't mean that I'm called to, again, a different way. So I'd say that the same things that we were told in seminary is the same thing which will apply to the laity, that we have pastoral callings, the call to, again, to be pastors, to go out and to shepherd and to help people. Again, I do it on the collective level, you do it on the level of your families. But both of us are called to be what? Shepherds of souls. Again, some of us more intimate, some of us more, again, broad. Likewise, we have spiritual needs. That we also have human needs, just the basic human needs. We also have, again, the last one, intellectual needs. In seminary, this was what we referred to as the 4 pillars of our formation, of how we were formed to be good and holy priests. Because if you only had 3 of them and you were missing one of them, you were theoretically not going to be ordained. Because to be a good priest, you had to be balanced in all 4. And so that's why we were taught what all 4 were, is that we have to what? And these things never go away. Just because we were taught them, we never mastered them. So just because we were taught the intellectual and given Masters of Divinity, and this is what my professor in seminary told us, he said, don't think that ever because you got the Masters of Divinity, you are the Master of Divinity. We're still, as priests, called to learn. The intellectual need to grow in intellectual understanding. But we also what? We're still human beings. Just like all of us are human beings. And we have basic human needs. The need for intimacy, the need for love, these types of things. That these type of needs have to be balanced and likewise met. But we also have the needs of mission, the need to go out and to serve, the need to go out and make a difference in the world, the pastoral. That we have the need to take care of people, to nurture and protect. We also then have likewise the spiritual needs, the deep needs of our hearts, the deep needs where we find meaning, where we find, again, not just, again, mission, where we end up being like Martha, but we also have what the needs of spirit, where we are like Mary, where we enter into that intimacy with God, where we have that time for prayer. These are, again, part of the ways in which we're being called to balance. And that's it. All of us are called to be taking into account these 4 things, because if you're a great human being and you're a spiritual person, you know what your pastoral approach is, what you're going out to do, but you don't have any intellectual knowledge, it's going to be a problem. Likewise, if you're really smart and you know what your mission is and what, you're very holy in your spiritual life, but you don't know how to be a basic human being, and this is also going to be a problem. You're going to drive people away. Or what, if you're very smart, you know how to be a human being, you are great in terms of your mission, but you have no spiritual life, you're going to have huge problems. Just as if you are what, very smart, you're human, and you're very spiritual, but you have no motivation to go out and help others, no motivation to go out and to evangelize, no motivation to be a pastor, you have a problem. Likewise, you can be missing 1, 2, or 3, or 4. You can be missing all 4. Most people are not missing all 4. Most people are usually struggling with 1 or 2. But we're called to balance these things in our lives and ask ourselves, and I can't tell you what these are for you. But each of us, if you take time in prayer and you ask the Lord, which of these am I struggling with, and where am I being called to act on these things? Where maybe, again, if you have, like for me, I have to set 3 alarms in the morning sometimes. Because I know that I'm weak in the area of waking up in the morning. So that means that I'm on the human level, I need to learn to be a better human being, and that's where the discipline comes in. Again, this is not an equal balance. Again, when you're talking about scales and balancing, you don't want to be like Bacchus who gets drunk. Again, the Greek god of drunkenness. Again, balancing is all about weighing different things. And so one of the ways in which we balance, just like liquor, again, you can only have 1 ounce of 1.5 ounces to 5 ounces of wine to 12 ounces of beer. I'd say the same thing is actually true of the soul and spirit and body. And this is what we were actually told in the seminary as well. For every 8 hours of work that we do, you can probably do about 4 hours of relationship work. For every 4 hours of relationship work, you might be able to do 1 hour of spiritual labor. And you'll end up being just as exhausted in this comparison. So to think, that's where people will think that they have to give 100% of their time to God, which means they have to be, again, that I should always pray more. Well, there's always this illusion for many people, especially people who are trying to be faithful, I should be praying more. Well, what they mean sometimes, and there's this illusion, that's why I say that it's an illusion, the question is how much are they being called to pray, and are they doing it? That's a principle of Ignatian spirituality. Choose and know how much you're being called to pray, and then you can evaluate and say, are you doing it? As opposed to thinking that that your spiritual life has to be 8 hours a day, or even 4 hours a day. No, the things of the Spirit take up less of our time, because they're potent. They're potent, and they're also likewise exhaustive. They exhaust you. Just like a relationship, you can probably talk for some of you might be thinking 4 hours of talking with a person would be hell. But for the most part, 8 hours of labor, you can do 8 hours of labor to 4 hours of relational, emotional things, to 1 hour of true spiritual things. And so that's why when balancing, we have to recognize that balancing is not an equal balance. Again, this is also why even when you look at the third commandment, which is about balance, again, when we find ourselves imbalanced, again, the third commandment is all about balance. Recognizing you have 7 days out of the week. One thing, the first day of the week is Sunday, so give the first day to God. Sometimes we think of Sunday as being the last day of the week. Sunday is the first day of the week. It's the beginning of a new week, which is why you give your best to God. That's how you know you're balanced. You've given your best to God. You've fulfilled the first commandment by giving that day to God. And then you have 6 days to work. And even within that day, on Sunday, you don't have to spend 24 hours of it in prayer. You go to Mass, receive the Eucharist, and spend the rest of the day with your family. This is what it means to be balanced. People who can't do that are not living a temperate life. Does this make sense? But again, God doesn't want you to spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at church. And I don't want you to spend that. I'm not going to see you that much. I'm going to shut my door. It's not temperate behavior. You don't fall to one extreme or the other. You find the balance. Recognizing for the most part, now again, just because you're not called to that, you are called to pray each day. Just because you're not called to do that, but you're not called to pray necessarily depending on your vocation, again, for 12 hours every day. This is why, again, the set amount of time corresponds to your vocation, which is why adoration, thanksgiving, which is where you pray throughout the day, adoration is your concrete block. Petition, where you're praying for others, and intercession. Again, if you look at the structure of the Mass, this makes up about 45% of the Mass, adoration, where we grow in our understanding of God. The first half of the Mass. Second half of the Mass, Eucharist means thanksgiving. It's 45% of the Mass. Only 5% of the Mass makes up petitions. Only 5% of the Mass makes up intercessions. This is the structure of the Mass, and I would say this is the balance of a healthy personal spiritual life as well. When you're missing one of these things, adoration combats dryness and depth. If you're struggling with dryness and depth, it's probably because you don't have a lot of adoration. Thanksgiving combats anxiety, fear, and depression. Petition combats pride. Intercession goes against selfishness. So if you, again, this is why people think that, they're like, how'd you know what these things were when I tell them certain things? I'm just looking at your symptoms. I just look at your symptoms. If you're confessing self-centeredness, then I'm assuming you're not praying very much for people, because that's a focus on themselves. If you're struggling with pride, I'm assuming you're not praying for what you need. You're not cognizant and taking time of self-awareness. Again, if you're struggling with anxiety and depression, I'm assuming you're not thankful as thankful as you should be. And likewise, if you're experiencing dryness and lack of depth, it's probably because you're struggling in consistency in that block of time. Does that make sense? So this is, again, one of the ways in which we can balance and likewise say, am I balanced in my spiritual life? Which is why, again, also balance in the way in which we give love. This is why I talk a lot about the 5 love languages. The ways in which we connect not only to God, to one another, but also to God. Do we have these ways of connecting to other people in a balanced way? Because if we're missing any of them, we're going to have problems. And likewise, God demands the same from us, because He gives all of love languages in all of these ways. And then finally, because I know we're running out of time, we start the week out with the 3rd commandment, which is a call to temperance. Let's just, again, key word being start. We give our first to God. Which is great. I don't say ever great excuses when people say, well, what are the reasons why I can skip church? I say you can never skip church. Again, but I also don't want to go to this extreme, that you go to church or you go to hell. The devil's going to get you, because this is only going to motivate a person for so long. Fear does not motivate people as much as love does. And I much prefer love than fear, which is why I won't use fear. But there are sometimes great reasons to miss Mass. Temperate reasons. To sleep in? No. Again, to cut your grass because you have chores around the house because you need to get things done? No. Again, because you have lots of work, because you didn't work enough during the week? No. There's not good reasons to skip Mass. Studying for kids because they have a test in the morning? No. No. God is more important. Their relationship with God will bring them peace and understanding, which will help them in a study. Because you're on vacation, it's not a good reason to skip Mass. Even if you're on a cruise. Again, no. Again, cruise ships usually have Masses, which is why if you plan ahead of time, you can find a cruise ship which has a Mass. And likewise, more cruise ships will give more Masses if people start only going on the ones that have Masses. So we're encouraging an industry, when we don't stand up for our faith, to be intemperate and to allow us to be intemperate. Likewise, if you are pregnant and you're having your baby, that's a very good reason to not go to Mass. It's a good reason. Again, someone's dying. Yes, that's a good reason to choose not to go to Mass. Don't skip Mass. Choose not to go to Mass. Because charity dictates you're with that person who's dying. Again, when you're going to see someone who's sick, again, 3 of them have no reason to skip Mass. 1 does, because they're sick. If you're sick, don't come and get me sick. Again, Super Bowl is not a good reason to skip Mass. We have TiVo. Spending time with your children watching the Super Bowl is not a good time. Again, bring them to Mass and then go TiVo it. Again, your kids' soccer games or your grandkids' games that are going on. Again, great reasons to spend time on family. These are not good reasons to not go to Mass. These are ways in which you teach your children, if you don't, or your grandchildren, that these things are more important than God. Your basketball games, the soccer, the volleyball, all these different things. But if this is your reason for, yes, that's a good reason, because it's uncharitable to get me sick. Okay? So if this is a reason, now if you were out the night before, partying and getting drunk, and then you feel sick in the morning, that's not a good reason to miss Mass. This is what temperate behavior. That we recognize that when you've been intemperate, this doesn't give you an excuse out. Your kid is screaming, or your grandchild is throwing a temper tantrum. Well, if they're hurt, then definitely take them to the doctor. Take them to the hospital. And you are not obliged to go to Mass. But if they're throwing a hissy fit, and they don't want to go, and it's causing you to have stress in your life, that's not a good reason. And sometimes that can be us. The person in our lives that we love who should be acting like an adult is not. No. If they were not going to go, then at least you need to go to Mass. Because what? This is temperate behavior. Otherwise, if we let go of temperance, we will become imbalanced. You get an important call on the phone from a friend you haven't talked to in a long time. Again, charity. Charity dictates that one is that if it's your friend who you talk to, if it's from 30 years, maybe that friend needs you. But for the most part, these types of cases are very rare. That's why we don't, in the church, we don't say that there's never reasons for this. You can always find reasons, but again, that's always why we look at our priorities and we say, am I being temperate? Have I been temperate? What areas of my life is the Lord calling me to? So next week we'll go into the virtue predominantly of action, which is the virtue of fortitude. Yes?
I have a hard time when I got a really bad cold, I'm sneezing and hacking. And
Don't come.
I really think I shouldn't come to Mass, right?
If you're hacking and sneezing and everything, don't come and get me sick. No, don't spread the disease. So, but if you have the sniffles, I mean, obviously we don't want, but we're just telling people to be reasonable.
Right.
And that's the same thing that the church calls you. If you're sick, if you think you're contagious, you have a good reason to stay home. But if you are going to go to a football game, or you're going to go out to a movie, and you don't mind infecting people at the theater, then go to church. If that makes sense. All right. Let's go ahead and close with the prayer. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time to come together today. Just ask you, Lord, to open up our hearts to receive more fully your word. Help us to see where we're being called to be temperate and give us the courage to act. Help us, Lord, to have the self-awareness to always be aware of where you're calling us, not only to be healthy, but also ultimately to be joyful, so that we can go out and share that joy with those persons in our lives who need it. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Have a good day.